part of the day, the afternoon, with a story. Keep forgetting to tell this one, but I like it. It's a good story. I think you'll like it too. So when I was in Oxford, I was at this workshop I mentioned in the previous hour. And so I'm sitting there, and after it's over, my friend who's the Orthodox Sofer. And so Sofer is the word for scribe. So Sefer is book. Sofer is the scribe. So he produces the book. And in Hebrew, most nouns come from verbs. So like in English, if a person does a lot of running, you might refer to them as the runner. You know, in your neighborhood, there's the jogger. Everybody knows the jogger. You know, that's the person that runs way more than he or she should. But that's kind of, it's a characteristic use of that particular participle. And so a sofer is a person who's involved in the work of being a scribe. He works with Sepharim. So anyway, after one of the teaching times, he comes over and he says, hey, the Oxford Philharmonic is playing live at the Sheldonian Theater tonight. You want to go? I thought, wow, how often do you have an opportunity to be invited by an Orthodox Jewish scribe, and you know, I'm a goy. How often do you have an opportunity to do that, and to go to the Sheldonian Theater, which is 500 years old or something, and watch the Oxford Philharmonic? There's no way that I'm going to say no to this guy. So we do that, and then we spend some time together. And it just so happens that day on the way home, I'm getting ready to get on the bus, and this homeless guy comes walking up, and he says, "Hey man, do you have some change?" And I had already met him, and I thought, I'm going to give him some money. So I reached into my pocket and I pulled out the only coins that I had and gave them to him. And I got on the bus, and I realized I gave away my bus fare for the next morning on the way back. And I'm thinking, oh no, that was dumb, because it was 10 o'clock at night and I had to be there at 8 in the morning. So I sat down by this guy, and I sit down, he's about my age, and I said, hey, do you have change for a 20? And he said, no, why? I told him what happened. And then he delved right into a discussion of the ethics of homelessness and whether or not you should give money to a homeless guy. And so I'm thinking about it, but he doesn't have a British accent. He has an Irish accent. We're moving on along, and so I'm staying at a different university. It was called Oxford Brookes, in the dorm, because it was in the summer, school was out, so they have conferences there, and I was staying. Well, we go to the same place together. It's like at the end of all the bus route. Everybody's getting off, and this guy's still about the ethics of homelessness. We ride the whole thing together and get all the way to our stop. He's getting off at the same place as me. So this guy is staying at the same university where I'm staying, and we walk to the dorm. He's staying at the same dorm as me. We walk up to my flight. He's staying on the same flight as me. And this guy was an Irish Catholic philosopher who teaches at a university in Spain, and he was there as part of a conference too. So I was there for the OCHAS workshop. He was there for a workshop, and the guy was sharp, and so we kind of made friends. So I'm a Baptist Protestant minister. This guy is an Irish Catholic philosopher. Well, the next day, my Jewish Orthodox sofer friend says, hey, after the workshop today, you want to go up to the top of the library and look at some scrolls? I said, sure. So we walked up, and we're looking at scrolls, and you know, there's scrolls from all over the world. We looked at one from China, a Torah scroll from China. That was a new one for me. We're looking at that thing, and we're there with Judith Schlinger, who was possibly the world's premier expert in medieval Hebrew manuscripts. She's there. So we're looking at these together, and I get some pictures. And after it's over, I said, hey, you want to go to the Eagle and Child, which is a pub where C.S. Lewis used to go and hang out with J.R. Tolkien. So he said, sure. And so this may be the only Orthodox Jew in Oxford, but we're walking together, and you know, he's got a yarmulke on, he's got a white shirt, and you know, he looks like he's Jewish. So we're walking along together, and we get to the Eagle and Child, and we sit down, and we have a couple of soda waters, and my Irish Catholic philosopher friend calls me. He says, hey, where are you? Or he texted me. I said, I'm at the Eagle and Child. He said, I'll be there in a minute. So he walks in. He sits down. So there we are together. a Protestant Baptist minister with an Irish Catholic philosopher sitting by a Jewish Orthodox scribe. We're sitting there together in a pub. And I said, I think I've heard this joke before. So we're sitting there together. And then my friend, Sofer, he pulls out a book that he'd written. And he turns it to Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. And he wanted to test my Hebrew skills, because in his book it wasn't identified. It was just 2 lines from Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. Well, that's a poem, and it opens with a chiastic structure. And poems oftentimes open with this particular structure. So he pulls it open. My friend does, who's Hungarian and who lives in Jerusalem and lectures at the National Library of Israel. He says, what's this? I said, well, that's Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. And he says, well, yeah, that's good. And I thought, phew. I just translated Jonah chapter 2. I'm glad, I just translated Jonah chapter 2. And so then I get into an exposition of how an evangelical interprets the book of Jonah and what that means, with my Irish Catholic friend who's a specialist in ethics, and my Orthodox Jewish chauffeur who's a specialist in producing manuscripts. So I do an exposition, and I get to the end. I said, so what do you think? And they both nodded their heads, and my Jewish friend said, I think I'm going to go get some kosher food. So he got up and he left, and that was that. But actually, the first thing he said was, I think you're right. And then he got up and he went to get some kosher food. But anyway, I got a picture of that moment, and the 3 of us are sitting together. And if you want to see what it looks like for, and not an actual joke, but an actual situation with a Protestant Baptist minister, an Irish Catholic philosopher, and an Orthodox Jewish sofer, I've got it on my phone. Okay. So that's my story for the day. Now, I noted earlier that there was an official outline, and with the questions that we had the first part of the day, we obliterated that outline. And we talked about whatever we wanted to talk about, which essentially covered everything a little bit. And so there's a couple things I want to go back and hit. And while we were on the break, Joshua took me into his library and showed me a few books I wanted to show you guys. Somebody asked about having the Codex L, which is that big codex back there. If you could get it, get it. Well, here it is, not in facsimile form, but here it is in a mass published form. So this is the book form that's not a facsimile, whereas the facsimile is a reproduction of the actual thing. So do you guys get the difference between the two? Okay, so like a book would be you take the content and you reproduce the content. A facsimile is you reproduce the actual form of that original. So it would be like if I wrote a love letter to my wife, somebody could then take the content and publish it in a book, and it wouldn't look like my handwriting. It would look like the typeface that the printer used. Versus a facsimile would be if I wrote her a love letter and somebody went to the effort of recreating the style of my handwriting, the way it was laid out and everything, almost like a photograph. So here you can get Biblia Hebraica Leningradensis in book form, and Joshua had it back there in the library. This form is called the Biblia Sacra. This is my favorite form of the text because it's got the Old Testament Masoretic text in Hebrew, and in the New Testament it's got the Greek New Testament there. So you have your Greek and your Hebrew in one book. So that's beautiful. The only downside is it's small, and it can be taxing on the eyes after a while. And then we talked about crowns. This says Kether Yerushalayim. So that means the Keter, the crown of Jerusalem. So that would be like the Aleppo Codex. You can see it for free online. It's digitized, and you can just Google Aleppo Codex, and you can see it in all of its glory on the internet. And this is a, what is it? Okay, it's like companion volume. Okay, so there's this. Well, since we obliterated our outline, And somebody was saying that occasionally there's like a Hebrew class here, but not very often. That means that probably most people don't know Hebrew, and you may never heard Hebrew read. So I thought it might be interesting if I read a poem in Hebrew. And this poem is from the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you think about this, Ecclesiastes is attributed to Solomon. So you have the wisest man who ever lived, second only to Christ. And he's writing in Hebrew with all the full mastery of the language, with all of his wisdom and all of his brilliance, and with the capacity to use a variety of poetical forms and other literary structures. So in terms of literary brilliance, the Bible itself is absolutely brilliant in terms of its literary composition. I mean, it's absolutely great literature. The intellectual capacity that you see represented in the pages of the Hebrew text is astonishing. And sometimes you hear that in Hebrew, poems don't rhyme. You guys ever heard that before? Well, that's not entirely the case. Most of it doesn't, but some of it does. And there's a lot of rhyme that takes place in Hebrew. Sometimes it's referred to as assonance. Sometimes you have rhyme based upon a correspondence of the S sounds, like even Genesis chapter 1 has that. Well, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, that introduces the theme of that whole book. The opening section is a poem. It's a 10-verse or 10-line poem. And it's composed very carefully, and it walks the reader through a certain progression. And as you would imagine, a person with the intellectual capacity of Solomon, writing about the meaning of life, essentially, he's not just going to compose a book. He's going to do it in a way that is absolutely astonishing in terms of its beauty and its complexity. So here's the opening poem of Ecclesiastes. It says, Divrei Kohelet ben David, Melech b'Yerushalayim. It's the words of Koheleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Listen to the repetition of a certain idea or sound. Havel Havalim, Amer Kohelet. Havel Havalim, HaKohavel. You guys hear the Havala sound? That's the word for vanity. So in the first verse of the poem, he has a thematic idea based upon this concept. And so eventually, or essentially, he's going to argue that life cut loose from a vertical perspective is absolutely vain. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 uses of the term vain in that second verse. So if you're curious about what the poem's about, there you go. You have the repetition of this key idea. It's a thematic concept. Havel havalim amer kohelet, havel havalim hakohavel. Ma yithron la'adam, bekol emelo, she ye'emo tachet hashamesh. What is the advantage for man and all of his labor with which he labors under the sun? And if you're curious about what Solomon knows with that, you can read chapter 2. That's where he describes all of his accomplishments. And everything from gardening to building of palaces to water reservoir that can water a forest of trees, all the experiences of men. He's done all those things, and he's here to tell you that it's all meaningless, cut loose from God. So what is the advantage of man? What profit does a man have in all his labor, wherein he labors under the sun? So I'm going to read it all through without stopping. That way you can get a sense of it. Havel havalim amer kohelet, havel havalim hakol havel. Ma yithron la'adam, bekol emelo, she ye'emo tachet hashamish. Dor holech, wa dor ba, wa ha'aretz le'olam omadet. Wa zarech ha'shemesh, uva ha'shamesh. Wa el mekomo, sho'ev zorech humsham. Holech el darom, wa sovev el tzafon. Sovev sovev holech haruach. Wa'al savivotao shav haruach. Kol hanechalim porkim el hayam, wahayam einenu maleh. El makom she hanechalim holakim sham hem shavim lalachet. Kol hadivraim yegaim, lo yukal ish ledaber, lo tisba ayin lirot, velo timale ozen mishmoah. Ma she haya hu she yeyeh. Umasha na'asa הוא שיעשה, ואין כל חדש תחת השמש. יש דבר שיאמר ראה זה חדש, כבר היה לעולמים אשר היה מלפנינו. אין זיכרון לראשונים וגם לאחרונים שיהיו. לא יהיה להם זיכרון אם שיהיו לאחרונה. I am Koheleth. I have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. So he starts out with that introduction, who he is, the words of Koheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. There's the poem, 10 verses, and then he concludes by identifying himself again. The poem itself is so compelling that you just stop, stunned at the brilliance of what it is he's just said. So that's just one poem, one book of Ecclesiastes. And every page you turn in one of these scrolls, every panel you look at contains brilliance intricately woven into the style of the text. So even if it's historical narrative, you've got a whole bunch of literary features and literary devices, even in chapter 1 of Genesis. So when you look at chapter 1 of Genesis, any one of these scrolls, you'll look and you'll see several lines, and then you'll see a space. You'll see several lines and a space. And each one of those spaces is a parashot, and it corresponds roughly to a paragraph in English, and it even tells modern English editors and publishers where to put their paragraph symbols. And then when you get down to day 6, you have this extra long space where you have the uniqueness of human beings and man put in full display right there in a multi-line poetical device used to describe the image of God and man. Okay. Any questions about any of that?
That would be the Masoretic text? Like if I go home and look at my...
It's all the Masoretic text.
Yeah. All right. Just don't remember those spaces being there. But...
if you look in an English translation, the style and formatting from the scrolls is not present in the English translation.
Right. I mean, I have in my copy, I have a Hebrew.
Okay. If you're looking at a standard modern Hebrew Bible, it doesn't correspond to what you see in the scrolls either.
Okay. Gotcha.
So whenever they're putting it in modern print, they're not trying to preserve the layout.
They're just trying to use their space economically.
There you go.
Yeah.
They're trying to get you the content, but they're not preserving
Right.
the what it is, the tradition behind the spacing and so on.
Gotcha.
So that's one thing that you lose. Like when you get to the 10 Commandments, you don't have not, you know, then with a little line underneath each
Yeah.
one telling you what not to do.
Does the VHS keep that spacing?
No. It'll have insertions telling you when you have a closed paragraph and an open paragraph represented by a samach and a pei, but it's telling you sort of in an artificial way where those spaces are without preserving the spaces themselves. That's the way that a Chumash does it too. Yes?
A long time ago, I bookmarked a website that I could go on and see the Torah scroll in different, you know. But I sort of, in some iteration, I lost that. I could go on and see the Q scroll with Isaiah, which is really easy. But is there a website that you know of that publishes that and makes it easy to go on and see where you are and take a look at that, at the scroll? You know what I'm saying?
Right now there's a whole lot of different websites that have images of Hebrew scrolls.
I'm talking about the whole deal, the whole,
The whole Old Testament?
well, let's even say the Torah, just
Okay.
the Torah.
Well, there's a whole lot of them that preserve the Torah. In fact, the British Library, on their Judaica page, they have a lot of scrolls that have been photographed, and you can see their actual scrolls, and you can work through it. As far as whether or not they're tagged at the different verses, I don't know that.
Are you able to go on as a you know, civilian?
I think
you have
so.
to be, what?
I think so.
Okay. So you just go to the British Library?
Yes.
Okay.
And I bet if you Googled tagged Torah scroll, that alone would get you to a Torah scroll where the different verses were tagged for you.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome. Back when BibleWorks was still in existence, you know, they closed shop a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. it had the Leningrad Codex in color, and it's tagged. You can turn on a tagging feature there, so if you have a BibleWorks 10 or can gain access to it, you can see that. I have seen tagged Torah scrolls someplace. I have a mental image of it, so I know somebody does it. Okay. Anybody else?
I've got a question that has nothing to do with what you were just talking about.
So,
I
Okay.
can ask it later.
Well, that's kind of irresistible now, you know. You know you get a question.
Well, I was trying to get through Isaiah chapter 6
Okay.
in the Isaiah scroll, and where it comes up with the seraphim saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." All I counted was two holies.
Okay.
So tell me about that. I'm
Okay.
very interested in that because I'm very interested in that.
Okay. Well, we are starting to get probably off topic a little bit, but like I mentioned, I've obliterated our outline. And so, why not? Okay, so I just pulled up Isaiah 6 on the iPad. So I have a Hebrew app, and you can buy one for like $10, where it has the Masoretic text with all the vowels, accents, everything, and you can turn on an English translation that is a Jewish translation if you want, or turn that off. But it's probably one of the best known Old Testament passages. Would you guys say so? Isaiah 6.
It's one of the most quoted in the New Testament.
Anybody not know Isaiah 6? Okay. If you don't know it, you're afraid to raise your hand.
Well, this one's, you're on Mechon Mamre or whatever?
I'm on
Is that
what?
where you're on? The
The
site
website.
or whatever?
Oh, no, it's an app.
Okay.
It's a Bible app. So, let's see.
Well, this one's got 3, in verse 3.
Well, let me read it to you.
But, okay.
Okay, so I'll just start with verse 1. I'll translate as I go.
All right.
Bishnat Mot. It's in the year that Hamelech Utiyahu, in the year that King Uzziah died. Wa'era'ah, I saw Et Adonai, I saw the Lord. Yoshev Al Kisei, sitting on a throne. Ram, Wanasah, high and lifted up. Weshulael, Milaim, and the train of his robe was Milaim, filling Et HaHekal, filling the temple. Seraphim, seraphim. Seraphim Omdim, seraphim were standing about, Ma'al, were standing about him. Lo. Shesh Kenafayim le'echad, each one having 6 wings. Bishtayim Yekaseh Fanal, with 2 he covered with his face. Uvishtayim Yekaseh Reglal, and with 2 he covered his feet. Uvishtayim Ye'ofef, and with 2 he flew. Wekara Zeh El Zeh, and this one called to that. One called to another, What Amer, and he said, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That's 3.
I know, but that was not my question. My question is that in the Q scroll,
The what scroll?
like what you've got over there.
Oh, that scroll?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, in that scroll.
Okay.
I was looking at it closely, and all I can see is 2.
I don't think it's open to Isaiah 6.
Well, I meant the one that's like in the on the internet, the Q
Oh.
scroll that's tagged.
Q scroll.
Enter. The Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls that's tagged on the internet. But that's what I was looking at. I wasn't looking at it in the original.
Okay.
Live in St. Louis.
Okay. Well, I think the Great Isaiah scroll has Kadosh 3 times.
You think it does?
I think it does. I don't know that I've thought about it like that, but I'll take a look. Usually if it doesn't, if someone has a VHS, it'll have noted in the margin if that's the case or not. So one of the brilliant things about the Masoretic text, when you've got the Mazor there, the scribes have already gone to that work. They've counted every time, and they have put in the margin if there's anything that differentiates this particular tradition from another, they'll put a note in there. And if you have a modern day critical edition, in the bottom, it'll have the verse, and it will tell you which manuscripts have 3, which had 2, if there were some that had 2. They would put it all there, the Septuagint, the Vulgate, different other Greek versions, the Samaritan Pentateuch, it'll all be there. So they note all that stuff, which I can't recall ever not thinking that it was there. But we have a VHS. So we'll just take a look. We'll find out. Somebody else can ask a question while I look.
I have a Bible like that, Brian, that in the center margin will give me, it'll tell me what the Targum and the Vulgate, and like you're pointing out, all the different translations. If there's a variation in the way it's translated, and mine does not tell me that there's any variation in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3 that you're referring to, that Jake is talking about.
Okay. Okay, so here it is. Wekara zeh el zeh. Wa'amer, and one called to another and said, Kadosh, 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 Yahweh Tzevaoth. There's no notation, which tells us that there's no variation between the manuscripts on that issue. So there is no manuscript that's lacking one of those three. So that's nice. So here you have a complete reference work in one Bible, thanks to a dynasty of scribes that produced that over 500 years. Yes.
Brian, are you related to Kevin Bacon?
Hey, Janet, did you hear that? Well,
Now that you mention it,
here's what I'll tell you. Sometimes if I go to Starbucks and order a coffee, they ask what your name is and they write it on there. Sometimes they say, Kevin Bacon. And I go, and that's what it says on my cup. And there's this one time when I was teaching at the Master's College, something like this, and they were videoing it. And this guy videoed everything. And the next thing I know, the secretaries are laughing and giggling one day. And so I said, what's up? And it was a meme of me. And it said, Kevin Bacon teaches at Master's College. So it's not the first time I've gotten that question. Wasn't expecting it today, though.
That's a Jewish kind of answer. Good job.
Yeah, more recently it's been Tom Brady, and that one sounds better to me.
no, you don't look like Tom Brady.
Okay, he says no.
No, you look like Kevin Bacon, Brian.
Okay, all right. Well, he's a lot older than me. That's fine. So I actually covered everything I'd planned to cover today, I think. And so I'm trying to think what I can make sure to save for tomorrow. Okay, the only other thing I've got that I haven't talked about are papyrus fragments. So I guess I'll cover that and then I'll be done regardless of what time it is. Okay, so think all the way back to Egypt. So you've got Moses, the great lawgiver. He's been told by God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. So he does that. They get into the wilderness. He goes on top of Mount Sinai, and the Lord gives to him the Ten Commandments. Here you have an early writing medium. It's in the form of stone, written with the finger of God. After that, you have Moses producing the Torah on parchment. So you have this form for a huge amount of time. Well, eventually, you get to the New Testament era. And in the New Testament era, you then had this new thing called a Christian. And so these new Christians, they wanted to be able to take their holy book with them wherever they went. And obviously, you can't take it if it's in a scroll format for a number of reasons. One, it's written on only one side. And so these scrolls have twice as much space as they do space for content. So you could write twice that much on one scroll. But even with that, it's really inefficient. So after the New Testament was created, after the Gospels were created, Christians wanted to be able to carry their holy book with them. They wanted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all in one volume. Not only that, they wanted the Pauline epistles there. They wanted the general epistles, all that in one volume. And so this gave birth to the popularization of a codex. So a codex is a pre-printing press book that was the earliest form for literature outside of a scroll. And so as fast as Christians could translate this into their languages, they were doing that. So you remember the Roman road system. and how this is this system that was created by the Romans, but ordained by God to take the gospel into all parts of the world. And so early on, they were going into Africa with the gospel. They were going into Europe with the gospel. They were going all over the world with the gospels. And everybody who was a Christian longed to have the gospels in one easy-to-carry, portable medium. And so that becomes the Codex. And some of the earliest scriptures that have been discovered, some of the earliest manuscripts, have been papyrus fragments from the Gospels. And I have fragments from 3 of those. And they are from the Gospel of John. And these are fragments that are stored in university libraries in Europe. And we have some of those here for you guys to take a look at. So these are produced on papyrus, just like the originals. It's really impractical to produce anything on papyrus, especially when it's done this exquisitely. So our friends in London who produced this went to a lot of effort to recreate as closely as they could the fragments that are in the university libraries in Europe of the oldest New Testament Gospels that we have, New Testament manuscripts that we have. This one is Chester Beatty Papyrus P46. It's got its own Wikipedia page. And you can Google P46 and it'll tell you a lot about it. You can go to Wikipedia, type it in, and learn all about it. But it's from the Gospel of John, front and back. It's reproduced exactly like the one that is at the that is in Dublin. It's a Chester Beatty Papyri. So that's what that one looks like. And then here's another one. This one's P52. This is from John's Gospel. It's at Manchester in England. And so these have been produced on papyrus with a laser printer, an extraordinary laser printer, and they're very close to the original. The difficulty is that the university that houses them, each one is at a different place, they don't let anybody look at them because they're so important, so rare, so valuable. Nobody gets to see them, no matter who you are. They're locked away. And so trying to produce an exact copy is very difficult because of that. And this one is P66. This is in Geneva, Switzerland. So these represent the oldest New Testament manuscripts that we have from as early as 50 years after the death of John the Apostle. So in the early years of the church, Christians were going all over the place. Now, I was going to save this to another day, but I'll go ahead and tell you now. So they started going all over the world with the New Testament. Now, I mentioned they went into Africa. Well, you guys remember in Luke chapter 8, the events that occurred there? Anybody?
The centurion sending his servant, Jesus.
Okay, so in Luke chapter 8, we have Philip the evangelist. So Philip the evangelist...
You said Luke chapter 8.
I'm sorry.
You meant Acts
Acts
chapter 8. Written by Luke.
Okay, so that's why you guys are looking at it. Acts chapter 8. Okay, now you know what happened. Philip the evangelist. Okay. So he's preaching, people are getting saved. The Lord tells him to go along this road over here to so-and-so. It's a wilderness place that takes us. So Philip goes down to this place, and you're reading this and you're scratching your head. Why in the world is the Lord telling Philip to go to this place, out here in this wilderness area? All this detail is really extraordinary for something like this. So he goes down, and remember what he saw. You remember.
The Ethiopian eunuch?
He sees the Ethiopian eunuch. So here he's described as Ethiopian eunuch, treasurer to Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. Okay, so historically, all of the Egyptian queens were referred to as Candaces, like the Egyptian kings were referred to as pharaohs. So the Ethiopian queens were referred to as Candaces. And there was a long historic interaction between the Ethiopians and the people in Palestine. You have references to Ethiopians in the Old Testament. Possibly Moses married a woman who was Ethiopian. She was described as a Cushite. and that caused some problems. But anyway, there's this long historical storied interaction between the two. So here you have a guy who's been to the temple in Jerusalem, and he was there worshiping. So this means this Ethiopian eunuch, who's an official to Candace, is a convert from whatever to Judaism. And he's there, and he's on his way home, and remember what he had.
Isaiah scroll.
He had an Isaiah scroll. So he had enough money that he was able to acquire an Isaiah scroll, like that one. It probably looked like that, because that one is a replica of the Great Isaiah Scroll, which dates to like 250 BC. So the original would have been a few hundred years before the Ethiopian eunuch. So he's got a scroll like that, and he's in his chariot, and he's reading Isaiah 53, sometimes referred to as the fifth gospel, and it's pointing to Christ. And he stopped in his chariot, and he's reading this, and he's just reading it. So we know this. He's multilingual, because he can actually navigate a Hebrew scroll. But Ethiopic is a language that is sort of the traditional Ethiopian language. It is a Semitic language itself. And so Ethiopian isn't that different from Hebrew. There's a relationship between them. And so it would have been not too difficult for him to move back and forth between them. So here as he's literate, he can read Hebrew. He's apparently a convert to Judaism. He's in the wilderness reading Isaiah, and Philip walks up and he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" He says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the guy says, "How could I, unless some man tells me?" And the Lord has told him, "Join yourself to that chariot." And so Philip gets up into the chariot, and he explains to him from Isaiah that Isaiah is talking about Jesus the Christ. So they're going along together. The Ethiopian eunuch becomes a Christian. And he says, "What prevents me from being baptized?" And depending on the manuscript that you're referencing, Philip either says, "Nothing if you believe with all your heart," and then some leave that verse out. That one has a question mark over it. But in any case, becomes a Christian. Philip takes him down into the water, baptizes him, and then Philip's taken away. And it says the Ethiopian went on his way rejoicing. So you read that and you wonder, what else to the story is there? What more could I be missing? Because don't you feel like there's more to the story?
Yes.
And there's some reason why this is recorded there. After all the things that are not recorded, this one's put there for a reason. Well, one of the earliest nations to become officially Christian was Ethiopia. So apparently the Ethiopian eunuch goes back, he preaches Christ, people get saved. You don't really know a lot other than that. And then around the 3rd century, Christians start showing up. Well, around that time, there were a couple of merchants, we know from secular history, a couple of merchants were shipwrecked off of the coast there, and these merchants could read and write, and they were taken into the king's household and became the tutors of the king's children. Well, they were Christian, and the king's family becomes Christianized. They become believers. And so from very early on, the Ethiopians get saved. And then that's just one of those people groups in that area. Well, you don't really hear anything else about it for a few centuries. And then in the 6th century, missionaries show up and find that there's already Christians there. And remember, this is way before the Bible's in English in Europe. All this kind of stuff is happening all over Africa and all over the Middle East before our theological forebears, if we identify with the Reformers, were ever on the picture. So anyway, so that happens in Africa. And like a lot of languages, the Bible gets translated into Ethiopic or Ge'ez. Jewish materials were already translated into that language, and just like a whole bunch of other languages, and they don't really factor in a whole lot. Well, in the 1950s, a lady traveled, I think, from somewhere in the UK to Ethiopia, to this monastery in Axum, and she encountered some monks. And they said, "We have the Gospels here, very old version of the Gospels. No one's ever seen them except for us." And they showed them to her, and she recognized that they were of great age. And so she left there, and she reported that there are these very old gospel manuscripts in Ethiopia that nobody knows about. Well, nobody heard about them again for a while, but in a couple times over the years they've been observed, and then I think about 8 years ago, some people were able to have a look at them, and the monks gave them permission to carbon date them. And so these gospel manuscripts in Axum, Ethiopia have been carbon dated, and they date to like the 4th to 6th centuries. So like AD 350 to AD 650. So very early on, before a lot of people for a long time thought that the gospel ever got into Ethiopia. And so these monks have been guarding these manuscripts for 1,500 years. And nobody has really known about them until just a few years ago. And so no Westerners had seen them except for this one lady in the 1950s. So in the 600s, when the Muslims came in, they protected these manuscripts from the Muslims. And then in the 1880s, when the British showed up and stole a bunch of stuff, they protected these manuscripts from the British. And then in the 1930s, when the Italians came in and set up an Italian puppet government, they protected these manuscripts from the Italians. So they've been guarding these all their lives. Well, just 1 year ago, we had an invitation to come and look at them. And so our team, my friends the Falters that have been producing all this, as well as a professor from the University of Southampton, and then we had some support at Oxford and from some friends. We traveled there, and we got permission from the monks to go to the monastery. They don't show these to anybody. To go to the monastery and look at them. The regional, like the villagers, they gave us permission. At least they didn't try to stop us. The local government gave us permission, and the national government gave us permission, as well as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So 5 levels of obstacles, to getting to access those. So we go there. It was September, and after 6 hours of talking to the monks, they took us into their treasure room. And these manuscripts had stayed in a cave for most of 1,500 years, but they had, in the recent years, had taken them out and destroyed them. So we go into the treasure room. The men, they wouldn't allow the female past a certain point. And so we go in, and 3 of us, we go into their treasure room, and they have lots of manuscripts, old manuscripts, and especially these gospel manuscripts called the Grima Gospels. And they are the oldest illuminated gospel manuscripts in the world. And they're some of the oldest, if not the oldest, illuminated manuscripts of any kind in existence. And these guys have been guarding them there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for all these years. And we got pictures with them. So here we are. So there's the abbot of the monastery. And here's the guy. This monk traveled with us all over Ethiopia. So that was an adventure. Not sure if you ever spent any time with monks, especially if they didn't speak your language. But this guy was in hotels with us. We flew on planes together. We traveled through the back wilderness of Ethiopia together to get to different governments. But he's holding one of the 2 Grima Gospels right here. There's 2 of them. And it's deteriorating. But this thing dates, it's over 1,500 years old, this particular manuscript. Carbon dated to that age. And this man here, with his hand on his heart, he's Jewish. And his dad, the reason why we were able to get in here, is this guy's dad is the guy who took the Red Cross to Ethiopia in the 60s. So because of his father's humanitarian work, he already had a good relationship with them. And it was so unusual for us to get to see them. There's only a handful of people from the West that have ever seen them. When we finally got to the national headquarters, the government was upset because the Minister of Cultural Heritage is not allowed to see them. So he's an Ethiopian. And there were a couple of these individuals, and they said they wouldn't even allow us to see them. The monks won't allow us to see these manuscripts. So we went to the monastery and tried to see them. They wouldn't allow us to do it. But the difference was, I'm a Christian pastor, and we were wanting to help them conserve them because they're being eaten by insects. So that was September. We went back in January, I think it was, or February, and met with them again. And then we invited the Department of Cultural Heritage to come to London and look at some of the manuscripts that our people make. And so some of these things here, because of the high quality of them, Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, 12 Ethiopian diplomats flew to London to look at the process of creating these facsimiles that you see here. And I didn't get to be there. I had another event where I had to be. But here they're looking at the process of creating facsimiles, or at least the product of other facsimiles that have been made. So that's what that is. And then these are possible because of this lady. She has an extraordinary ability to make sure that the product is exactly like the original. So she'll spend 24 hours on a sophisticated laser printer in Milan, Italy, looking at the colors, making sure they're right before it ever prints its first page. And then once they start, she's able to monitor it. They created some copper plates. When the temple in Jerusalem was sacked in AD 70, they hid the stuff that they had, and they created these copper plates with instructions about where to find the stuff that they hid. So these copper plates are metal, and they're written in Hebrew, and the copper plates were discovered, and our friends created a facsimile of those copper plates, and it took 3 years to get the patina on them right. So they aged them for 3 years to make them look like the originals that had been discovered. So that's their area of specialty, of producing those kind of facsimiles. So one of the big takeaways with that whole project, sometimes you hear something like Christianity is a white man's religion. When I hear that, I like to say, oh no. The Ethiopians have had the gospel since before the end of Acts. You know, it's been there all this time. And these guys have been guarding these manuscripts for 1.5 millennia. And they would die to keep an outsider from getting close to them. And so, that's one of the big takeaways.
So Brian, how have you been able to save those manuscripts? You haven't talked about that yet.
Well, this is a special case. And it's a special case not just because of the manuscripts that we're dealing with, but it's Africa. And it's Ethiopia. And in a country like Ethiopia, you have suspicion. Some of these African countries have been exploited by Westerners. And so you have that whole level of difficulty to get through. And then you have corruption. These governments are really complicated. So like in Ethiopia, they have a number of regions. And each one of these regions is made up of a certain ethnic composition. And so the person who's president of each one of those regions reflects the tribal makeup. You know, they've got, I forget how many tribes, but like 80 languages in Ethiopia. You know, it's really complicated. And the person who's currently the prime minister, if I remember right, his father's Muslim, his mother's Christian. He speaks not only Ethiopic, but a majority language, and he has enough similarities to a large enough swath of the Ethiopian population that he was able to get elected and he's popular. And he's done a lot of good things, but it wasn't that long ago, just in the past few months, one of the presidents of one of these regions was assassinated by his bodyguard because he was plotting a coup. So you have these individual tribal groups vying for either to be separate from the rest or to have more influence than others, and it's just really complicated. Sometimes I think it's complicated here, and I hear of stories like that. That's really difficult. So in this case, the monks sent me a letter, and so it's from the monastery, stamped with the monastery stamp, inviting us to come in and do the project. It also has the stamp from the region. So you got to get the region. Just to go into the region, we had to show our passports. So it's like going from one country to another. So just to get in, we had to have our passports. So the regional authorities stamped it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has okayed it. So that's 3 of them. All the way up to the national government. And they're the holdup. They travel to London, but they're not all on the same page if they want to let these people come in and do this project or not. The lady here, she has a PhD. Her name is Dr. Kasa Harut. She's the current Minister of Cultural Heritage. She wants to do the project, but because this is possibly Ethiopia's greatest national treasure, or cultural treasure, one person doesn't have the say. It's a group of people that have to decide. So to get consensus on a group like that, it's very difficult. And then after that, then you have funding issues. You know, do you have the $3 million it's going to take to finish the project? And so you've got to maintain funding present, ready to go, while you're waiting on the folks to make up their mind. So it's been a year, and we don't have official communication from them about whether or not to start.
Can you explain the technical aspect? You said that it's insects that are threatening these manuscripts?
In this one, because they're 1.5 millennia, you have lots of things that are threatening them. You know, you have the fact that they're written on old and primitive writing medium. You know, I think they're papyrus. Not papyrus. I forget what they're made of. You know, what the material is they're written on. But they have their Wikipedia page. You can go check that out. Type in Garima Gospels and it describes them. But they're Garima, G-A-R-I-M-A. The guy who started the monastery was named Abba Garima, Father Garima, and that was around the 4th century, and he's the guy that produced those gospel manuscripts. So
How would you protect them from insects, as an example? Is there do you know what the technology or whatever the...
the first thing you do is you fumigate them.
Yeah.
So you fumigate them, get rid of the insects, and then you need to build a climate-controlled environment on site because they're not going to let those manuscripts leave the monastery premises. So they need their own climate-controlled environment, a museum, essentially, where they can be protected. So you got to put in place all the mechanisms to maintain a climate-controlled facility in the remote mountains of Axum, Ethiopia.
Do they trust you to be able to do this?
They've sent us the letter and asked for help.
No, I mean the monks. Are they...
They're the ones that sent the letter.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah, so they're ready to go. But the national government is the one that's the holdup. Anybody have any questions about any of that? Yes.
I've got some other questions.
Okay.
Somewhere I came across the idea, somebody was promoting the idea that Hebrew was the original language that God gave to Adam and Eve. Do you have a comment or an opinion on that?
Yeah. My comment is I love the idea. I mean, if I was going to create a language and give it to human beings, I'd make it Hebrew. That's about it, though.
All right, Don.
My friend Kevin Parvey says you better learn Hebrew. That's the language of heaven. That's the language of God.
Okay. Well, he has insight that's amazing.
Yes.
Most Brazilians think Portuguese is the language of God, so I don't know.
Well,
You got all that in Revelation.
we probably think American is the language of heaven.
You talked earlier about the origin of written language, and that was very interesting. Can you comment on that in relation to what, like Ugaritic or Chinese?
Okay. So the written form of Chinese came along a lot later. Ugaritic is a Semitic language that is written. If you study Ugaritic, you read it based upon impressions that happen in clay. Cuneiform is the form that language takes. And you can Google cuneiform and see what that looks like. One of the difficulties is you've got a mechanism and you're tapping into mud and you're creating these shapes in mud and you read it like that. It's enough to make it go blind.
Is there a source, something you'd recommend to read on that topic? The origin of language, especially from the perspective you were talking earlier, somebody who
Okay.
was Semitic and knew hieroglyphics and
Well, I'm glad you asked. There is a new book that's out called The World's Oldest Alphabet by Douglas Petrovich. It's controversial because he proposes that the first alphabet was in fact a Hebrew alphabet, and he gets into the discussions of why in that. It's controversial, but it's really interesting and really compelling. A second thing you can do, there's a film that came out in March called Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy. Did anybody see that? Okay, so if you saw that, I was in that. And so you may recognize me from that. But that describes some of that storyline and some of that argumentation. You thought it was Kevin Bacon?
Do you have a band too?
A band?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's hip hop, so he can't.
What was Patterns of Evidence 1?
The Moses Controversy. You can stream it from Amazon,
Huh.
but it gets into some of these questions. And then Doug's book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, gets into them as well.
Brian, you had talked about the Yemeni project that the Israelis brought all the Yemenis up. Of course, as you know, they brought thousands of Ethiopian Jews out also. Is there, do you think, a correlation between the presence of Jews that genetically they can get back pretty far and the presence of Christians? I mean, it's an evolutionary kind of...
Evolutionary? Explain the evolutionary idea.
Well, I mean, the Jews that were there, I mean, obviously, Christ said, you know, we say the Jew first and then the Gentile, and so the apostles that went to Africa were looking for a fairly rich field to start with, because, you know, even Paul has to describe Judaism before he can make Christians in many cases. So the Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, were probably there when the apostles got there.
Oh, yeah. So that's totally the case. So one of the fields that's really interesting where there's overlap between Christian studies and Jewish studies is that. So the Ge'ez language is an ancient Ethiopian language where you have Jewish manuscripts written in that language as well as Christian manuscripts. So you have very early interaction between the two. So that's how, in part, our Jewish team and myself were looking at these manuscripts. So one of our colleagues who's at Oxford is a specialist in Hebrew micrography. So what micrography is, you may have seen this someplace. It's where you have an image. It's beautiful, and when you start to look closely, you realize that the image is made up of tiny little letters. So imagine taking the book of Jonah and condensing it down into one small picture, and the picture is like Jonah in the well. So you're looking at Jonah in the well, but when you look closely, you realize it's a whole book of Jonah written out in tiny little letters, and they did it in such a way as to create a picture. So that would be micrography, and it's real small. And some of these manuscripts, in fact, the Mazor Parva is almost a form of micrography. And if you look at Codex L, you see some of these images in different places. So, especially in carpet pages. So you have these images written with these tiny little letters, and you had a lot of that in the medieval era. So one of our colleagues that I met at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, her PhD is in medieval Hebrew micrography. She also works in Ge'ez, because that was a language, a Semitic language belonging to the Ethiopians in which Hebrew manuscripts were produced. But because some of the earliest manuscripts that we're interested in are Christian manuscripts written in that same language, you have Jewish and Christian overlap. So to your story about the Ethiopians that were delivered, this is a fascinating story. So for years, there have been Ethiopians who have claimed to be part of the lost tribe of Israel. And so, I mean, that sounds like one of these myths. And nobody believed it. Everybody was like, yeah, right, that's not true. Until they DNA tested them. And they realized that they were ethnically Jewish. And so that created this whole other discussion, because these ethnically Jewish Ethiopians were religiously Christian. And so during the 1980s, early 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, these ethnically Jewish, religiously Christian Ethiopians who claimed to be part of this lost tribe, the Israelis couldn't figure out what to do about this, because they wanted to go to Israel, because they were languishing there in Ethiopia. So this was a big discussion in the Jewish community. What do we do? Are they truly Jewish? And they finally decided, yes, they are Jewish, at a level that we need to be interested in their well-being. And one of the principles in Judaism is Jews protect other Jews. care for other Jews, like Christians care for other Christians, that same kind of a principle. So they figured out these are ethnically Jewish individuals, dark-skinned Christians. So that's really complicated, and they took a long time to figure this out, as you might expect. And then in 1991, the Ethiopian government was unstable, and it's been unstable a whole lot of different times. But it was unstable then, and the first George Bush encouraged the Israelis to go in and do a secret operation like they did with the Yemeni Jews. And so they did that. And so they took advantage of this unusual law. So one of the laws in Israel is that El Al, their airline, can't fly on Shabbat. Because Shabbat's a day of rest, you can't work on Shabbat except to save life. And this is similar to one of the issues that Jesus rose up. You know, on the Sabbath, is the Sabbath created to raise life, to save life, or to destroy it? So he was a fan, apparently, of healing people on the Sabbath, which his antagonists didn't appreciate. Well, this particular Sabbath in 1991, at the prompting of George Bush I, the Israelis decided, we're going to take our out-of-service El Al planes and fly them in there to save life. So they did that, and in 24 hours, they got out something like 13,000 to 14,000 Ethiopian Jewish Christians. And they did it so fast, they set a world record for the most number of people moved in that short a period of time. They also set a world record for the most number of people on an aircraft. So they had this one, I think it was a Boeing of some sort. They took out all the seats so they could fit a whole bunch of people on there. And on this one airplane, they had over 1,100 people on this one airplane. But they were able to do it because the Ethiopians are small. So they had over 1,100, I think 1,157. You can go to Operation Solomon on Wikipedia, and it will tell you the story. So they got over 1,100 people on there, and they came off with more than they put on there to begin with. And they did that because some of the women had their children hidden in their clothes. Because they're so small, they were able to hide kids, and there was at least one baby born on that flight en route. And so they got a lot of Ethiopians back to Israel, and it's been difficult for them ever since. Because here you have people who speak not Hebrew, being taken to Hebrew, and they came from a place that was primitive, so they didn't have marketable skills, they didn't have a lot of trade skills, and they didn't speak the language of the community that they were around. And there has been this difficulty of Ethiopian Jews fitting in ever since then. And just this past year, there was, I think, an Ethiopian Jewish man who was shot by police. And he was shot and killed. And it was like the Israeli version of when that happens here. And so the Israelis were saying, this racism has to end. And I thought, this is remarkable. This is the same kind of thing that we're experiencing here. But because of the lack of skill, lack of integration, all that, it has created a phenomenon there where they're struggling to, even now, these decades later, to get people fully integrated. But sometimes you see like they're soldiers from the IDF, and you have maybe a blonde-haired girl who looks very European, very German, by a very dark-skinned, African-looking gal, and you're thinking, okay, they're both Jewish, how does that work? Well, that's part of how that works. Yes.
So there's an archaeological theory that I've heard that the Ark of the Covenant may be hidden somewhere in Ethiopia. My question is, while you were with the monks looking at the scrolls, did you happen to see the Ark?
I've seen this movie before.
Is your name Harrison Ford also?
That's Kevin Bacon.
No. But in the movie, when they opened it up and the things came out and killed everybody, it wasn't a good situation. So I decided if I encounter it, I'm not looking in there.
Close your eyes.
Yeah, closing my eyes, that's what Harrison Ford did. Close his eyes, they didn't see whatever those things were coming out.
Have you seen Todd's Ethiopian Preacher's Bible?
Yeah.
Is that the language, what did you call it, the Ethiopian ancient language? Is that?
Ethiopic or Ge'ez.
Okay, yeah. Do you think that's what it is? Because he wasn't sure.
I don't remember.
Okay.
It's written with those same characters,
Yeah.
so it could be. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
Are the Coptic Christians and the Ethiopian Christians connected or related
Yes.
in any way? Is Coptic and Ethiopic, is it the same language? Or are they different languages?
Different languages, but the church is very closely connected. So the Coptic Patriarchate appoints the Ethiopian Patriarchate. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is its own church, but it's under the authority of the Coptic leadership.
Yeah, and those are the ones that have the ark. They're the ones that claim to have the ark, the Coptics.
And you said that Ethiopic is Semitic, Brian. And I've got a question because the people of Africa, of Egypt in particular, are descendants of Ham, as opposed to Shem, the three brothers, Japheth, Shem, and Ham of Noah. Is the Hamitic language, is in any way similar as Hamitic and Semitic, Shemitic? Is there any kind of linguistic connection between these two?
There's a whole lot of issues all wrapped up into that question. I don't know how to answer it, except that the Semitic language family is broad. And you can look at Northwest Semitic, and you can look at other regional variations of Semitic languages.
So when the children of Israel were in Egypt, like Joseph and Jacob, and during the captivity, before they were delivered, were they actually speaking two different kinds of languages, the Hebrew Shemitic and the Egyptian Hamitic?
No. But Jacob was referred to as a wandering Aramean. And if you remember when Jacob and Laban were interacting, they made this heap of stones that were a witness. Laban named the heap of stones in Aramaic. Jacob named the heap of stones in Hebrew, and it gives both versions of that name in those respective languages. So those Aramaic and Hebrew are similar enough that you can move back and forth if you know them. But they're different enough that if you haven't been exposed to them before, you don't understand the other.
Are you saying Aramaic is Egyptian? And oh, you're just trying to make a comparison between Aramaic and Hebrew? Is like Hebrew and the Egyptian language?
No, I'm not talking about Egyptian. So
I was, and I'm confused by your
Okay.
example.
Okay, that's okay. That's an extended discussion that is related to the relationship of languages. And ancient Egyptian is not. You would have to know ancient Egyptian. It's not a language that I work in, but it's different enough that they wouldn't be able to speak to one another. But a guy like Joseph, for example, if you remember, when his brothers came into his house or were around, they were speaking to each other, not realizing that Joseph could understand it, and vice versa. But Joseph could understand both of them.
But he was able to speak to his Egyptian courtiers, and his Hebrew brothers could not understand
Right.
what he was saying.
Yeah, that's true.
So, after we're done, could I show you the Isaiah part that I was talking
Sure.
about?
You
Because I
found
got
it?
it in front of me.
Okay, that'll be interesting. Okay. All right. Anything else? It's about 2:30. We can wrap up and we'll come back tomorrow. Have a whole bunch of other things to talk about. Okay.
Can you give us a little preview of what we're going to talk about tomorrow?
Sure. So I'll take a look at my trusty iPad.
Did we cover the things you wanted to cover today? It sounded like we destroyed your outline.
We did. We covered them all. We just didn't cover them in straight lines. You know, we kind of moved around a lot. So tomorrow, we will talk about there's a day where we have a combination of a Q&A panel and some other concepts. So I'll talk about those, probably integrate those into the discussion tomorrow. So like what are textual artifacts? So one of the things that makes these unique, just to give you a heads up, one of the things that make these kinds of things unique is they're not just, it's not just scripture, and it's not just artifact. So these are artifacts in that they represent a technology of a previous era. And that technology is in the form of book production. That's referred to as diplomatics. So diplomatics is its own field related to the production of communication. Art history is an aspect of that, where you look at the style of pictures and other things that are involved. Codicology is the science of the study of books. Paleography is the study of the science of ancient languages. And so we'll be looking at textual artifacts and what they are and why they're meaningful. Because there's a lot of artifacts out there. But we're not going out there looking for Indian heads, which, you know, if you want to do that, that's okay. We're not going out there looking for bowls that were used by Native Americans. My wife's mother was a registered Choctaw. I think that's great, but I'm not looking to understand that language. But we're looking at artifacts that are unique in that they present propositional truth. So the truth content of the artifacts that we're looking at presents an entire worldview. It presents an ontology, a view of the nature of existence. It presents a view of the nature of reality. It presents a view of the nature and limitations of human knowledge. How is that possible? It presents its own ethic. So we're looking at artifacts that are conveying a message in the form of propositional truth. So we'll explore some of that, as well as the message that they convey and some of the things related to its content that make it unique. So that'll be something that we spend a lot of time on.